here together today to meditate, discuss Buddhist teachings. But the reason is compassion. Wishing to free ourselves and others from suffering. To lead ourselves and others to greater happiness. So we're going to study, contemplate, meditate a little bit. In order to take one more step, right, increasing our own wisdom and understanding, so that we can have that much more skill and insight to compassionately extricate ourselves, free ourselves from suffering, and also especially be of benefit to others who are numberless, countless others. So our motivation then, right, is that and also to be able to help others more effectively. And last, with that motivation in mind, we can just think, for those who are familiar with it, right, I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The merits I create by practicing giving, the other perfections, and now become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, we'll come into a more interactive mode. We'll do more contemplation and meditation for a little bit. That's just to kind of settle our minds at the beginning. And so, just from last time, I'll briefly, we covered, just to remind people, right? So we've been going through this class is on presenting the path, right? And so we're presenting the path in terms of these different scopes of practice. Right? So last time we talked about what's called the low scope, and we ended with refuge. There's going to be a whole module on karma, so I'm not going to go into karma in detail, but I'll just say, so then, so the last point of the low scope though is guarding karma, which actually means really, it means not harming yourself and others. I will say one more thing about karma because it's going to relate to today's topic. Sometimes sometimes karma is taught. One way of talking about karma is in terms of the 10 non-virtues. It's like not killing, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, not lying, like that. Right? And so that's very important. Actually, so there are 3 of bottom: not killing, stealing, and committing sexual misconduct. And there are 4 of speech: not lying, not saying hurtful words, not harming, not saying things that are mean. Not saying divisive words, so that's not, harsh speech would be like saying something like, cursing at somebody or insulting them and making them feel bad. That's different than divisive speech, where you don't necessarily make the person feel bad at the moment, but you say something that drives people apart. Right? So you say something to somebody that makes them not like their friend or their spouse or their, or parent. You say something, or let's say you say something to a child to make them feel disconnected from their parent. That's another kind of negative speech, divisive speech. And then the last one is gossip, which is just meaningless talk, like talking about nothing and wasting your own and others' time in that way. And then there are 3 of mind, which are like hatred and coveting what you don't have and ignorance of wrong views. So those are the 10 non-virtues. So one way of presenting karma is to present those 10 and then you guard it against those. But I'll say something else about karma too, because it relates to what we're going to cover today. Another way of discussing karma, and it relates to what we started with today, actually what I just did, is in terms of motivation. Because actually, really what karma is karma means action, right, in Sanskrit. But actually, the nature of a karmic action is determined by the person's motivation. And so that's really important, and it's going to relate to what we're going to talk about today, so I'll just say a little bit about that. So, for example, like generosity is not, well, sorry, we say it. Giving, I'm going to change it. Generosity is always good karma, but giving is not always good karma. Because, for example, if you give something to somebody to show off, right, then your motivation is to show off. Right? It's not generosity. Generosity is a state of mind where you feel happy to give something with the wish to make somebody else happy. Right? So if you give with that state of mind, that's always a positive action. So the nature of karma, actually, is, in Buddhism, is really determined by the motivation of the person doing the action. Does that make sense? So in that sense, then you have to qualify those other teachings, actually, right? Like, so for example, most of the time when somebody lies, right, it's to protect their own ego, or to manipulate somebody, or to get something from somebody, or to avoid that person thinking you're doing something, that I don't want them to do. So that's egotistical, right? And in that sense, it becomes a negative action. That's different than if somebody were to, tell a lie out of extreme compassion to protect the life of somebody else, right? Well, then the motivation is compassion, so that wouldn't be a negative action. So the main determining factor for karma is motivation. And one way of describing that in Buddhism is this: is that any, and we're going to get more into this, but any afflicted state of mind, right? If you have ignorance, which we're going to get to what that means, right? And then if you have an afflicted state of mind, and then you do an action based on that afflicted state of mind, like anger, right, or hatred, then you're creating a negative karmic action. If you do it, Nagarjuna said, who was the great Buddhist Indian philosopher, he said, he said, actions done with ignorance, attachment, and anger become negative karmas. Actions done with no ignorance, no craving, and no anger or hatred are positive actions. So he was really determining karma based on the state of mind of the person doing the action. So in that sense, what is, so then if you think of like, again, because this is going to kind of transition between the low scope and the middle scope, which is our main subject for today, is the middle scope. But so actually in Buddhism, really the main training then, it has to be watching your own mind, right? And doing things in the right place, or with the right motivation, with the right state of your heart, however you want to call that, right? And so actually you can't really tell if a person's doing a positive. First of all, you can't really tell if somebody else is doing a positive or a negative karma. You can have your own concept, right? Based on how they appear, but only someone who's introspecting, it actually takes introspection to know if you're doing something positive or negative, right? And that's quite important. Like, I sometimes think about just small things, like sometimes when Lama Zopa said, one time Lama Zopa said, don't stop doing the little bit of Dharma practice you pretend to do. Which I thought was sweet. And, what he was getting at there, right, is what's your motivation, right? Like, there is even if you're going through I guess he was saying, like, because even if you're going through the motions, at least you're not hurting anybody while you're doing that, and maybe eventually it'll become sincere. Right? But, and it's like that teaching by, there's a funny, I saw that before probably, but let's see. There's a funny story about Lama Dromdonpa, who was a previous incarnation of the Dalai Lama, where he was, he had a student, I can't remember the order of the things, right, but the student was doing prostrations, and Lama Dromdonpa said, that's nice that you're doing prostrations, but it'd be better if you practice Dharma. And then he saw his student sitting meditating, and Lama Dromdonpa came by and said, that's good that you're sitting in meditation, but it'd be better if you were practicing Dharma. And then, the student was doing some, I forget, some other action, making offerings or something. He said, oh, that's nice, you're making offerings, it'd be better if you were practicing Dharma. And finally the student said, well, then what's practicing Dharma? And I think actually the answer Dromdonpa said is, give up on this life in your mind. Give up on your ego. Give up on self-cherishing, on only caring about yourself. Give up on your small mindedness. And actually, give up on this life in your mind relates to the three scopes, right? What he was actually saying was practice the first scope, right? Because remember what did we say last time? The very beginning point, the first scope, where you've entered into Dharma practice, means you're not doing things only for your own comfort and only for like happiness. Because actually that's not a spiritual practice, right? If you're just doing things so you can be comfortable, so you yourself can be comfortable and happy, right? First of all, if you're grasping it, actually, because it's an important point. If we're going to get more into this today. But if you're doing actions to try to be comfortable and happy in this life, you won't be comfortable and happy in this life. That's the problem, right? It doesn't work. And so that's what, so Dromdom was saying, enter into Dharma practice, right? Do something beyond just looking for comfort. And what was, so what was that person doing, actually, right? They were sitting like this, right? Or they were doing some prostration or something. But the point is that their mind wasn't in the right place. Right? Their mind wasn't for example, in a state of compassion. Their mind wasn't in a state of seeking something either to benefit others or something that was actually spiritual in nature. They were just going through the motions of something. So anyway, this gets at this point about karma, right? That karma is determined by the motivation. And so the nature of actions is determined by the motivation. So that's why, actually, right, at the beginning of class, if we assert that our motivation, if we kind of get in touch with the motivation of compassion, and if we think, okay, I'm listening and meditating, discussing, with a motivation of compassion, then the action can become a Dharma practice. Otherwise, even like Dromdom would come here and say, that's nice that y'all are discussing Buddhism, it'd be nice if you were actually practicing. So anyway, so the idea is motivation is the determining factor for karma. But I'm going to switch over to the middle scope now, and then this will become clearer, I think, as we discuss that. So the middle scope, right, is I want to talk about it a little bit in terms of the Four Noble Truths. I think that's a good way to do it. So, actually, how many people here have heard of what the Four Noble Truths are? Most of you? Okay. Right, so people know, right, that was the first teaching that the Buddha gave, right? The first teaching he gave after he became enlightened was on the Four Noble Truths, and he taught that many times in his life, right? And actually, I want to say a couple comments though. What is noble truths, actually, right? The Four Noble Truths. Like, actually, the Sanskrit word there is Arya. And they translate Arya as noble. But actually, in Buddhism, really the meaning of Arya is a person who's seen the truth, a person who's seen the ultimate nature of reality. So Geshe Sopa, in the reading here, he says these are truths seen by Aryas. So in other words, a person who's in their own meditation has seen the ultimate nature of reality, then when they look around, they see the world in terms of the Four Noble Truths. The reason why they're called Noble Truths is that, actually, and the Buddha, it's interesting because in India, the idea of noble at the time of the Buddha was actually about caste. The traditional use of that word was high caste, right? If you were a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, which was a warrior, then you were high caste, and they were low caste. And the Buddha basically said that's complete nonsense. The Buddha said there's nothing noble about being born in some one caste or another. That's irrelevant. He said that has no meaning. He said noble is a person who's seen the truth, and if you haven't yet seen the truth through meditation and through experience, then you're not yet really noble. So being rich doesn't mean you're noble. Being famous doesn't mean you're noble. Being powerful doesn't mean you're noble. So that's the Buddhist. So from the Buddhist time on, the definition of Arya or noble was somebody who sees the truth. And somebody who's still caught in illusion doesn't see the truth. So the idea is that when you've seen the truth, then you see these four Arya truths. These four ways that you see these things directly. So there's a problem there, right? Which is that we, ordinary people, don't see the Four Noble Truths, actually. There's an immediate problem, right? The Buddha saw them because, in other words, he came and taught, right? And he had just achieved enlightenment. So for him, this was his way of viewing others' reality, right? His own and others' reality, actually. But we ordinary people don't see the Four Noble Truths when we see things. So the first noble truth, right, is the truth of suffering. And so the point here is this, is that what we see as happiness, Aryas see as suffering. So the point is that they're saying, the Buddha was saying, you're confused about the nature of experience. So sometimes people, like when people talk about the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, some people say, it's not really clear, right? Sometimes people say, well, everything's suffering. And then you could say, well, sometimes I feel happy. What does that mean, right? And then sometimes people say there is suffering, right? Which, that's not much of a news bulletin, right? Like everybody knows there's suffering. So we have to so I want to get a little deeper into what is the first noble truth, right? Because what did the Buddha mean when he said, the first Arya truth, right? The first truth that Aryas see is the truth of suffering. And see, for an Arya, they just look and they see it that way. For us, we have to contemplate, right? Because if we don't contemplate it, we're not going to, that's not our way of viewing reality, right? So we have to actually, like, hear about this teaching and then contemplate it experientially. And also, I want to say this too. You know, the Buddha said also, you know, what was that quote? Well, I mean, there are many different quotes like this, right? But one was about the goldsmith, right? He says, take my teachings away. A goldsmith, before he buys gold, he cuts it, he burns it. You know, what's the other one? Cutting, burning. It's one other thing. Anyway, but he was saying, like, you know, analyze it, check for yourself. So it's not saying you have to believe this, right? The Buddha was saying, these are the four, like, for example, these are the Four Noble Truths, but now you have to check them and see if you agree or not. Right? So you have to contemplate it in terms of your own experience. But even the first Noble Truth is actually quite, if we actually get into it, it's quite subtle. Because, I'm going to start, there are different, the Buddha presented that in different ways. So sometimes he listed 3 kinds of suffering, 6 kinds of suffering, and 8 kinds of suffering as ways of, the reason these lists are not like to, what's the word? They're not to, like, give you more homework or something. They were tools for contemplation. That's why the Buddha taught them. But I'm going to start with the 3 kinds of suffering, because I think it'll start to give the flavor of what we're thinking about. So the first one, I'm not going to emphasize much, because it was the suffering of suffering, right? And that's the one I said is not a news bulletin, right? Like, that's like, the suffering of suffering is if you have a headache, if somebody punches you in the nose, if you have the flu, you know, those are all, like, obvious, right? Like, we all know about that kind of suffering, right? And actually, you know, that kind of suffering, ordinary people and Aryas actually both recognize as suffering, right? It's the next 2 kinds that are the point of difference. So I want to get into the next 2 kinds. So the second kind of suffering is usually translated the suffering of change. And this one is subtler, actually, much subtler than that. So the suffering of change is this, there are different ways to explain it too, but, I mean different, you know, but the general, so let's go into it. So the suffering of change is what ordinary people think of as ordinary life, or ordinary happiness. So now we're not talking about when you have a headache, or when you have a sick, or when or you lost your job, or something like that. What we're talking about is something that ordinary people would think, oh, this is good, this is what I want to have happen, this is pleasurable. And, so I would say this, like, what the Buddha in this point is saying is, he's not saying, he's not saying you're wrong, right, to think, you know, to say, well, that not having a headache is better than having a headache, right? Nobody's saying, no, you should want to have a headache. That's not the teaching here. What the teaching is saying, from a spiritual perspective and from a psychological perspective, if you analyze more deeply, you'll see something else. Does that make sense? And so what the Buddha is saying is this, give an example. The suffering of change is like this. I'm going to give an example of an ordinary person's pleasurable activity. I'll say eating ice cream. If you're not lactose intolerant, or if you are lactose intolerant, it's okay. Either way it works. Both work okay. The idea is this, so a person, so I'll use, so like let's say, actually usually when people eat ice cream it's not because they're hungry, right? So I was going to say somebody's hungry, but actually usually when you eat ice cream it's not because you're hungry, right? Why does somebody eat ice cream? Usually, I'm going to give an example. Right? I'll use the time of myself, right? So a person's, a person's feeling stressed, right? Stressed out, and they think, oh, if I have some ice cream, that'll be pleasurable. I'll feel better. It'll be nice, right? So the beginning experience, they're suffering, right? It's not some grotesque suffering, it's not some horrible suffering, but it's a kind of subtle state of agitation, right? Like stress, right? So it starts off, so this is, now how is an art, like, to the ordinary person they say, oh, some ice cream, I'll feel good, right? Great, this is happiness. that's like an ordinary, like that's the ordinary person. Now when the Arya looks at them, they say, okay, let's watch this person's experience. Right? Or if we're watching ourselves experience and analyzing it, what we analyze is this. The beginning, I'm feeling agitated. Right? I'm feeling dissatisfied. Right? So that's not great. Right? That's a kind of suffering. Then I drive to the store, right, to try to purchase ice cream. Is that pleasant? Not particularly. Then I drive home, right? And then what happens? Like you open the ice cream, you get the spoon, you put it in the bowl, or maybe you eat it out of the thing, you never hear it. It depends. Right? But you start eating the ice cream, right? And what happens? So what an Arya, when they look at that, they say what happens is that this person was having the suffering of agitation and stress, right? And then they start focusing on a sensation, the sensation of sweetness and coldness on their tongue. And they get distracted from the previous sensation, right? Before they were stressed out, now they're focused on this pleasurable sweetness and coldness, and so they feel some relief that the previous suffering stopped. Right? So they've stopped one kind of suffering because they're focusing on something else. It's a new sensation, right? Then, if they continue that new sensation, right, which they're labeling at that point, they're saying, now I'm happy. I'm eating ice cream. Now I'm happy. Right? But then if they continue to focus on that new sensation, right, without anything different intervening, that eventually starts to become suffering. Right? So let's say the person's eating out of the carton, right, and they're eating their ice cream, right? And then there comes a point where they're eating it and they start thinking, wow, I'm going to gain weight if I keep eating this. Ice cream's not the healthiest food, but it tastes good. I want to keep eating it because it tastes good, but if I keep eating it, then tomorrow I might regret it. So they're like eating, and then there's this subtle, you see, like now a new agitation is beginning, right? I want to keep eating because it's pleasurable, but I should stop eating because it's not so healthy for me. Right? And then they keep eating. Right? And then they start to feel also, wow, if I eat too much of this, I'll also feel sick to my stomach. I really should stop. You know, eating a lot of ice cream doesn't feel so good after, after you stop eating. Right? So then they're saying, okay, I'll gain weight and I'm going to feel kind of sick if I keep eating, but I don't want to stop eating. And now an Arya is looking at this person and saying, okay, is that happiness? It's actually, there's this subtle suffering that's increasing, right? The longer the person's doing, and the more the person keeps eating the ice cream, right, their suffering's actually increasing, right? Where they're enjoying it, but they're feeling some kind of, what's the word? Inner conflict, let's say, right? And then actually, so imagine this: if you kept eating ice cream, right? Like let's say you just kept going, right? Then eventually, what would happen? Right? For sure, you would start to feel sick. Right? So, what an Arya is saying, right? An Arya, a person who's seen the truth, looks at an ordinary person's experience and says, "That's not satisfying. That's not satisfactory. In other words, if that's the best, that's not a reasonable." On a worldly level, the person calls that happiness, right? But is that a reasonable thing to call happiness? Not really. In other words, that's a kind of suffering. You see what I mean? Like, and the definition of this, now I want to go a little deeper, right? Is if you keep doing the action, will it remain happiness? Right? Will it continue to bring you happiness or not? If it won't continue to bring you happiness, then they say then it's not real happiness. Does that make sense now? I mean, this is the definition of the suffering of change. So you're doing an action trying to be happy, right? But if you continue to do it, you'll suffer, right? So they say that's not. And another example, sometimes when Lama Zopa teaches on this, he sometimes gives the example of like this, so it's cold out today, so I'll use this one. Like if you go to the beach, like we could say, oh man, it's cold here and it looks like rain. If I could go to the beach, like if I could be in the Caribbean or Hawaii or Miami today, maybe that'd be better, right? So then there's the suffering, right? You're thinking, I don't like that it's winter, that it's cold. If I were someplace warm, that'd be better, right? But then, like if you go to a beach, right, where it's hot, and you lay out in the sun, then immediately, like if you could suddenly be there now, you would say, oh, this is awesome. I'm not in Virginia anymore. I'm someplace where it's sunny and warm, and I can hear the ocean breeze, and this is great, right? And imagine, so it's a hot sunny day, right? So you lay out. So then what would happen, right? At first you would label that, this is incredible happiness. I've gotten away from the cold. And we're just analyzing experientially here. If you actually start to analyze your own experience, right? What would happen over time? And if you actually look inside, right? After a little while, right? Quickly, not that long, right? If you're American, you might start to think things like this, right? One is you might start to think, first you might have the thought, oh, I wonder if I'm going to get skin cancer. Right? Did I bring some SPF something? Right? And then you're saying, well, this is pleasurable. I like laying out in the sun. But on the other hand, what if I get skin cancer? Do I have the right kind of protection from skin cancer? Right? And then if you stay there longer, you start to get hot, right? And it's not something new intervened, right? What you were labeling pleasure, which is laying in the sun, you said, this is great, now I'm happy. And it's not that something new happens, right? It's not somebody comes along and hits you or something. It's not that kind of suffering, right? It's the suffering of pleasure itself, right? That you're laying there and then you start to think, oh, I'm hot. Now I'm worried about the skin cancer and I'm getting uncomfortable. Where can I go to get some shade? Right? Where it'll be cooler. This thing you start looking around. You think, I've got to move. And I've got to get in the shade now. Right? So then you move into the shade, right? And then you say, this is great. Now I'm in the shade. Right? Now what's going to happen? Right? You already know, right? Stay in the shade for a while, and then what you're labeling happiness, right, without any change, you stay there long enough, you start to think, well, it's a little cool in the shade, right? And also, the warmth of the sun was nice on my skin. If only I could go back over there, right? I'll give one more example, right? Relationships, right? It's the same, like, it's because we could say, okay, so it's food, it's weather, something like that. Right? But then relationships, same thing, right? When a person, right, if you analyze anybody, if you watch the experience, and again, this is what Arya see when they look at ordinary people. I'm just saying, like one time I asked Lama Zopa that, I said to Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I said to him, I heard that sometimes yogis, like Tibetan, and ancient Indian Buddhist yogis, there are these stories where they would be in these caves alone somewhere or in a hut in the Himalayas, and they would start laughing hysterically, just laughing wildly in their cave. And I said, what are they laughing about? I said, I really want to know, what would they be laughing about? There's nothing fun, there's no, comedy up in a cave, there's no, you can't see, there's no old Seinfeld episodes or something. What are they cracking up about? And when Lama Zopa, he gave a much longer answer, but basically what he said was this, he said they look at ordinary people, right? So he's describing an Arya now, right? He says they look at ordinary people, and those people, he said, they think they're happy when they're suffering. They think they're going to live forever when they're about to die. They think that cherishing themselves and only caring about themselves, not caring about others, is going to bring them happiness, and it only brings them sorrow. They think they truly exist in some inherent, intrinsic way, and they don't. He said, when the yogi looks at them, they have to either laugh or cry, so it's better to laugh, was his answer. So this is how a yogi looks at ordinary people. That's what it means, Arya truth. That's all I'm saying. Right? So I want to give one more example of the relationship thing. Right? So when a person's lonely, right? When a person's alone, doesn't have anybody, right? And they want to have a relationship, then they think, oh, if only I could be with somebody, right? If only I could be with this person. So they think that, right? Oh, if only I could have this partner. Oh, and this person's so handsome or so beautiful, and they're so nice, and they're so wonderful, and they're so kind, that if I could be with them, then I would be happy, and then life would be great. And then, so the Arya looks at them, right? So there's this process, right? So at that point, the person's not happy, right? Just like the person who wanted the ice cream, right? This person's agitated and unhappy, right? They want something. Then the person goes seeking, to have a relationship, right? And that process, as anybody who's done that, right? It's not the most fun process usually. There are lots of stories like that. So the process of trying to find a relationship is often quite difficult. There's a lot of hardships, right, to find that. Then the person, then finally the person goes on a first date, maybe they have their first kiss, right? And at the moment of the first kiss, it's just like the first taste of ice cream. The person says, oh, this is great, this is the best, the person's so happy at that moment, right? They think, oh, this is happiness, right? And then, right, over time, without any change, right, it's not that like nobody's substituting, nobody's slipping in some terrible person for the other person, with the same person, right? They continue to have contact with the same person who initially, like if you ask them right after, if you talk to somebody on the day they had their first kiss with somebody they really are falling in love with, right? What do they say? Like only positive things, right? Oh, they're great, it was so fun, right? Nobody's like complaining at that point, right? But then, if you continue, right, then always, right, there's no exception actually, that eventually the person starts noticing problems. Right? And the person starts to have like issues about that, right? And then, you know, right, and then eventually like the person's like saying, even, let's assume they stay together, right, then the person's saying, well, I wish this person would go to work, you know, like don't work fewer hours, you know, I need you out of the house, right, like, you know, like that, right? Whereas that becomes like, and then that's normal, right? No, whereas when they're first kissing, nobody says that, right? Oh, I need you to go away more. Like, don't hang around me so much. Can't you get some friends and go to the mall or something? Nobody says that on the day of the first kiss. Nobody's complaining like that. But if you analyze it, right? Like after a while, then it's always like that, right? Like, in other words, or if one person's not saying that, maybe sometimes one person's saying, no, I want you home all the time. Then the other person's saying, how do I get out of here, right? Like, I have to get, you know, I have to find some excuse to go, you know, and then, but that's just normal. In other words, that's not something pathological. That's just the nature of relationships, right? That there is, it starts off where there's a certain suffering, right? The suffering of loneliness. Then you relieve that suffering, so you think, oh, I'm happy. And then as you continue this new activity, right? Then you recognize there's a kind of unsatisfactoriness to that as well. And so, you know, so the point here, right, this is the noble truth of suffering, right? So that when the Buddha looked at ordinary people, right, and he had been, remember we had talked about his biography, he had been a prince, right? He was on track to become a king, you know. So his life had been filled with all these kind of pleasures, right? In terms of his context of time and place in India, he had all the best, you know, there's all the stories, right? He had the best cooks and they were cooking huge feasts and, you know, he had a wife, but also all these dancing girls and performances and, right. And it's the same thing, right? If you go to, like, you know that, right? If you go to, like, well, actually, you know, even like, if you look at, like, rock stars, right? Like, a couple of years ago, I read a biography of one of the Eagles, right? You know, and when they had the suffering of not being famous, right? Then he was so excited when they became famous. And then as you continued on, right? I mean, you know, he became a drug addict, and then everybody else became drug addicts, and they all hated each other, and they, like, were fighting over the money, and, you know, finally they kicked him out, and he was, like, resentful, and he wrote the book to put them down and say, idiots, you know, or something. Like, you know, and being a rock star is, like, the best, right? It's one of the best samsaric pleasures it's supposed to be, you know, but, and of course, his wife wasn't so happy because he cheated on her, you know, all those kind of things, right? But I guess my point there is, like, that's no mystery, but the point is what we never do, this is what the Buddha is pointing out in terms of the second of the three kinds of suffering, is ordinary people never do that in terms of themselves. Like, ordinary people do that in terms of others, actually, right? We can look at others and do that. You know, we can see that, right? You can say, oh, wow, yeah, look at that, you know, whatever. Keith Richards, wow, he used too much drugs, and, you know, being a rock star is not so great or something. But no ordinary people never stop while they're wanting something to say, oh, that's suffering. Nobody ever, right? So when the person's feeling dissatisfied and wants to eat ice cream, they never stop and say, wow, this is me compounding my own suffering. When the person's lonely and they want a relationship, they never stop and say, wow, this is me compounding my own suffering. Right? And I want to say too, like, because Lama Yeshe says this in the reading, this is not saying, I want to be really clear because Lama Yeshe says it very clearly. This is not the Buddha or any Buddhist or me or anybody else saying to you, don't do this or that. Right? Nobody's saying to you, don't have ice cream or don't have a boyfriend or girlfriend or don't go to the beach. Right? What this is saying, because remember, this is the truth for somebody. These are things for somebody who's seen the truth. Right? So what it's saying is, analyze your own experience and decide for yourself what to do. Right? So nobody's saying, like, because you know, sometimes they translate, Lama Yeshe says that, right? He says that in a reading, you read it, for those who read it. He says, one way of translating this is renunciation, right? So we're renouncing something. And so sometimes, like, Lama Yeshe said this and Lama Zopa said this. Sometimes when people hear renunciation, they think, like Lama Zopa said, that people feel like a balloon that just got deflated. You know, like, oh, I don't want to give up. So, you know, but Buddhism isn't saying give up something, actually. what Buddhism's saying is analyze your, and Lama Yeshe says this in the reading, right? He says, you have to determine for yourself what you're, like, what's happiness and what's suffering. There's not some prescription, like stop eating ice cream then you'll be happy. That's not what Buddhism's saying, right? Or stop having relationships then you'll be happy. Definitely, there's no way Buddhism's saying that, not at all. What Buddhism's saying is analyze your own experience and check for yourself, right? Rub it and, burn it, see if it's real. In other words, see if what this teaching is saying is true to your experience, and then you decide how you have to apply that behaviorally, and everybody's different, right? So there is no universal prescription. There's no prescription like, oh, then you have to become a nun, right, or a monk. Nobody's saying that. If you want to, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But what Buddhism's saying is, use these teachings and analyze it your own experience, and then you decide what you should do, like what will make you happy, right? And how to help others be happy. Does that make sense? So because it would be a mistake if you thought, sometimes people do that. Oh, so I'll give up my house, then I'll be happy. Right? Like, why would you be happy then? You're like, what does that mean, actually, right? Like, in other words, you have to analyze your own experience. So what this is saying is contemplate your own process, right? Contemplate your process of what you label pleasure, and see what's happening for yourself, right? And then decide, what do I do next? Right? And we'll get to what's the path to enlightenment. That's a different, path to liberation. But you can't get to the path to liberation until you've analyzed your own experience. I want to relate that teaching to one more teaching, and then I want to do like an interactive exercise. So I'm not going to get to the third. There are three. I remember I'm covering the three kinds of suffering. I'm not going to get to the third yet because that's complicated. So we'll get there. But I'm going to jump to the list of the 6 kinds of suffering, and I'm going to just cover one of them. The one that Kent Rinpoche recently taught said was the most important. So there's a list of 3 kinds of suffering, 6 and 8. So right now I'm just doing one of the 6 kinds of suffering, which I want to say is different from the suffering of change, but is very related to it. So that's why I'm bringing it up. So this is not the traditional way to do it, by the way. Usually you would cover all 3 and then all 6 and then all 8. I'm jumping around, so can you excuse me for that? But I think there's a use to it for our purposes today. So one of the 6 kinds of suffering, which Rinpoche mentioned and emphasized, is the suffering of never being satisfied. Right? They say in samsara, one of the sufferings is never being satisfied. And that teaching is it's different than the suffering of change, but it's related, right? So the idea is this. I want to talk just a little bit about the suffering of never being satisfied. That suffering is like this. Like, is there an amount of ice cream where you'd be satisfied and never want ice cream again? Like, if you had the best ice cream sundae in the world today, would you say that was enough? I don't need any more ice cream. Right? Or like friendship, right? That you would say, I had a great day with my friend today. I don't need friends anymore. I'm satisfied. Like for the rest of my life, I'm good. I can, that did it for me. I'm happy. Right? Or like a car, right? Could you say, well, I have this nice car, and when this one, so now I'm done. Like I don't need. When this one breaks down, I'll just walk. It's okay now. Like I'm satisfied. No, right? In other words, the nature. This is not the same as change. This is a different. It's the same objects, but it's a different way of looking at the same phenomenon, right? Whereas that when you get something that you want, the result is that you want more, right? Because, and it's related, I want to say, in my view, if you contemplate it, again, you have to contemplate for yourself, and this is just my contemplation, that these are related, right? Because what happens, right, remember earlier I said there's the dissatisfaction of some kind of suffering, then you achieve an object of desire, right? And you label that happiness until that becomes suffering, right? So the problem is that we get habituated to this moment of happiness, right? Where then when we're suffering, we think back and we think, well, when I had that first bite of ice cream, it felt better, So I guess I want that now. Next time you feel unhappy, right? Or now I want, whatever that would be, right? The beach or the this or the that. So that the problem is that there's another problem there, right? Which is that it never leads to a sense of permanent relaxation or permanent satisfaction. It's a cycle, right? Of wanting something, chasing after it, and then and actually it's very tricky because if you don't get it, right, there's two kinds of, this is actually, I'm getting a little more complicated, I'll just say it. There's 2 kinds there, right? So you want something, right? So there's different, actually this is related to the 6 kinds of suffering. So there's this process, if you don't get what you want, you keep wanting it, right? So if you want something and you can't achieve it, you keep wanting it and wanting it and wanting it, right? Until you achieve it. And then you have the suffering of having achieved it, right? Which we just talked about. And then, what's the right way to say it? After you've achieved it, then you want to do something else, but then you want that again, right? In other words, it's not like it stops, right? So, and even when people are, you watch, even when people are like, even after 20, 30, 40 years, right, it doesn't go away. It's not like, oh, now I don't need anything anymore, right? There's always this process of wanting something. What was it? Like anyway, yeah, people always want more. That's the issue. Like, it's that teaching, like, free, I mean, it is a worldly thing, right? But, like, nobody ever said, like, anyway, you get the point. I'm not going to go into more details. What I want to do, though, I'm going to go out of order. So what I want to do is this, because to me, this one is really important to contemplate, right? Because otherwise, there's really a danger, right? Anybody can read the Four Noble Truths and say, oh, there's suffering, there's a cause of suffering, there's an end to suffering, there's a path to the end of suffering. And what's it say that? Like, so you read the Four Noble Truths and you know what they are, right? But that doesn't help you at all, actually, right? Like, in other words, like if all you did, or very little, but that really doesn't do much experientially, right? In other words, if you know, oh, this is the list of what the Four Noble Truths are, in terms of your own life, that doesn't necessarily do much for you. But if you can analyze your own experience in terms of, is what I'm labeling, me personally, is what I'm labeling happiness or not, right? And what's happening for me? And am I really satisfied, or is there something wrong here, right? That becomes useful then, just to understand yourself and understand your own life and experience. Does that make sense, at least? So what I want to ask people to do is, each time we try to do is break up into groups. What I want to do is people break up into groups, small group this time though, only like 3 people, so like 2 or 3 or something. But what I want to ask you to do is this, is to share, use an example other than the ones I gave, first of all. But think of an example of something that recently you actually labeled happiness, right? Where you wanted something, and you either did or didn't. Well, let's assume you did get it, right? And it could be something as simple as a meal out, it could be something big, like a new job, whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be recent, actually. It can be any time in your life, but something that's still active. In other words, not, because for example, if it's a job, that doesn't have to be recent in the sense maybe I got the job 10 years ago, but if I'm still there, it's still relevant. So I'm talking about not something, though, that's irrelevant to your life now, right? And I just want to ask you to actually do what I just did, right? I did it about the beach, for example, right? But I want you to do it in your own experience, because otherwise this is not useful, right? So you have to relate it to your own experience. So the interactive exercise would be to share, each person to share one example. Does that make sense? And to have the other people's job is to listen and to help. Like, so to ask questions if the person's stuck or doesn't know how to analyze it. And you get what I'm getting at here? Is it clear? So you just analyze your own experience and ask, is that true? In other words, you can disagree, right? The Buddha said it's okay to disagree. So you can say, no, for me, chocolate is an ultimate happiness that never ends. And if I ate chocolate the rest of my life nonstop, I'd be happy. You can debate it. You can say that's true for me, and chocolate's the answer. It's okay. In other words, I'm not saying like it's not. You're allowed to disagree, but to analyze your own experience. Does that make sense? Any questions before we do it? Okay, so let's take like 15 minutes, because I want to have time for each person to really share one example and analyze. In terms of like renunciation, right? This idea of which actually some people the actual Tibetan, some people translate it as definite emergence, which sounds nicer. Definitely emerging from something sounds better than renouncing something. But anyway, but what I want to suggest is this is just from my own observation also, that if you don't meditate on these topics regularly, right, and deeply, then there's a danger that I just want to point out, which is then a person could almost like it becomes like we relate more to what Lama Dromdonpa was telling his student, right? Because then the problem becomes that you can, like, if you get into Buddhism, right? Let's say you like Buddhism and you're into it, right? But then you can say, okay, I'm going to renounce this, I'm going to renounce that. But it's like, what's the word? It's through some kind of effort of will that's not deriving out of insight, like from an experientialist, right? So you say, because anybody can do that, right? Like in other words, like anybody can say, well, I'm going to, whatever, I'm going to not do this behavior or that behavior. But what I want to suggest is this, is that it doesn't last then, right? Because if it's out of some kind of idea that somebody told me this is the right thing to do, so I'm going to do it, or I have this idea that that's what renunciation would look like. And Lama Yeshe in his book, he kind of makes fun of that in a way, right? He says he calls it almost like a renunciation trip or something, right? He's like in the 60s or something. You're on some trip and you're going to do this thing, right? But there's a problem there, which is it's just a trip, right? And then you'll have some other trip. And what I want to suggest is just I think this is what the teachings are saying really, is that really I think what one has to do is meditate over and over again on one's own experience, right? And analyze it and see for yourself, not just intellectually, but in some like experiential way, well, what's going on here, and what am I doing, and what's happening for me? Am I getting happiness or not? Is there a way to get more happiness? Because we all want to be happy, right? The Dalai Lama often points that out. But what's the way to say it? You know, we get a lot. I always want to say this too, right? Because you're also getting tons of input, right? Especially in our culture, right? Because we have more. Not that our culture is unique in this way. All cultures are the same, but we have more media, right? So we can get more exposure to this. I mean, how many messages do you get, right, a day, saying that if you achieve this, if you get this thing or that thing or this thing, then you'll be happy, right? Like all the Super Bowl advertising was based on that, right? That model of existence or of life.
I said beer.
Yeah, beer, right? Beer, or what was it, the newest car, or the newest, it was all there, right? Like, it's actually, it's all based on a fantasy, right? And we get tons of input like that just driving down the road, actually, right? Like a billboard or whatever. And so the point here is this, but that was always true. I want to say this too, that was always true, right? In other words, they just didn't have billboards and cell phones and TVs, but the Buddha was saying this, 2,600 years ago almost or something, whereas he was pointing out the same thing, so the dynamic's no different. And what the Buddha is saying really is this, somebody who's achieved the Arya path and seen emptiness directly, they see things naturally that way. Actually, when you're on the Arya, this is for Buddhist, people who are interested in Buddhist scholasticism. When somebody's on the path of seeing, which is the point where a person sees emptiness, the ultimate nature of reality directly, they actually have a direct insight into what's called the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. So at that point, they see all that directly. That's their experience, right? Whereas they get this experiential, direct seeing. And what they're saying is this, is when you see something directly, it's like having seen the Empire State Building directly. Nobody can say the Empire, if somebody says to you the Empire State Building doesn't exist, but you've been in it and gone to the top, somebody says it never existed, well, they can't convince you of that, right? There was, like I'm just giving you that's something I've seen directly, I've been there. So like nobody can say that never existed. I was there, I went to the top of it, like I know what that's like, right? So an Arya has seen these things directly, so they don't have to like figure it out. But we do, right? Because we're not at that point in the path. And so the only way to do that is to contemplate over and over your own experience and check, right? And meditate. And then what happens is, right, if you do that, this is what Lama Tsongkhapa points out in his Lam Rim teachings, in his teachings on the path, right? He says, if you do that enough, then you want to do something, right? Then you say, if you know there's a higher kind of happiness, right? Then it's not like, oh, I'm going to try to do this, and I should do it or something, right? And somebody told me to do it, and I'm a better person if I did that. It's not like that. It's like, of course I want to try to do this, because of course I'm going to make effort at that, because I'll be happier, right? Like, and I'll actually feel satisfied, And so if you see that through analysis, then it's not, you see what I'm getting at there? But the problem is that people don't want to contemplate this, right? Or don't spend the time, and then they expect to get a result like of some kind of enlightenment. And the only way to get to the enlightenment, right, there's a reason why the Buddha taught the noble truth of suffering first, right? Is you have to contemplate it, and then you get an experiential, like you're able to experientially move forward to something beyond that. So what I want to do also is this, I've been thinking to try to cover like all this material today, but actually I think this is so important that I don't want to rush through it. So I want to cover only one more thing today, and then we're going to spend next time also on this, the Four Noble Truths, because I think this is the most important for this is really an important part. So I want to cover one more thing related to the Four Noble Truths, and then we're going to come back to suffering next time and go through it. I'm going to get to the third kind of suffering, which I'm not going to cover it today. Remember I said there were a list of 3? We're not going to get to that today because I don't want
More
to.
suffering.
It'll just be. But I want to get to I want to cover one point about the cause of suffering, right? The second noble truth. So the first noble truth is is the truth of suffering, the Arya truth of suffering. The second is the Arya truth of the cause of suffering. And right, and you get that. I mean, I just want to point out something. Right? You get that there's a logical sequence here, right? In other words, why did the Buddha start with suffering? Well, that's something that ordinary people can see, right? If he had started with there's a cessation of suffering, like ordinary people wouldn't have been able to, from his point of view, he was at the point of the cessation. So if you were talking just about himself, he would say there's a cessation of suffering, right? But from an ordinary person's point of view, they wouldn't relate, right? So you have to start with their suffering. And these are things we can actually analyze in our experience, right? Then there's a cause, and then we have to logically deduce that there could be a cessation because we understand what the cause is, right? And then what would be that path to get to that cessation. So this is a way of presenting the Four Noble Truths for ordinary people, right? A sequence that ordinary people can relate to. And by ordinary people, I just mean people like us. Right? But so in terms of the cause of suffering, there are different subtleties with which that can be presented. So, in my opinion, the most subtle way of describing the cause of suffering would be ignorance grasping at inherent existence. That would be the most subtle, in my opinion, the most subtle. Different Buddhist scholars say different things, though I agree with the ones who say that. That the most subtle cause of suffering would be ignorance grasping at inherent existence. But that's not the level I want to talk about today, because it's too subtle. We'll get to that next time, that's why. Because that's that's philosophical, and it's hard to understand, and we won't cover it well if we try to cover it today. So what I want to cover is so then, a less subtle way of describing it is just ignorance. A less subtle way than that would be to say delusions and karma. But a less subtle way, which is actually one way that the Buddha talked about it, was he said that the cause of suffering is craving or desire. So that's a grosser level. Does that make sense? So the ignorance grasp. When Geshe Sopa talks about it in this article, he presents it as ignorance, right? The subtle ignorance. But then he says, from that derives craving or desire, and from that derive other causes, and then that leads to suffering. So I'm not going to get at the most subtle one today. Does that make sense? But I want to stay with desire as the cause of suffering, which is a more gross but still a valid presentation. Does that make sense? That's one that the Buddha used. And I want to ask this, is desire the cause of suffering or not? Let's just say, is that true, that desire is the cause of suffering? The Buddha said it, but is it true? Do you agree?
How do you define desire?
That's an important question. It's an important question, isn't it? Because I'll give an example. I think that's a very important question. I'm going to give an example. If I say, I desire that all beings be free from suffering, right? Is that the cause of suffering?
Yes.
Can be.
Because it's impossible almost. So you're going to constantly suffer because you constantly want something that is theoretically unattainable by human standards.
And if I say, I desire liberation from samsara?
But once you desire something, you've already lost. I mean, because you'll either get it and want something else, or you won't get it and you'll be wanting it.
Which is that's related to what we were just talking about in a way, right?
Yeah.
But if what you get is not needing to want anything else, then
Then explain what you mean.
I just mean talking about if you desire liberation from suffering, if you get liberation from suffering, it's not like you're going to be suffering from not having something else and want something else. I'd also say that desire for wanting all beings to be free of suffering wouldn't cause you suffering, because it would, it would release that self-cherishing kind of attitude that causes your suffering. In my opinion. I don't know.
Other people? Yeah, other people? Yeah, let's keep going. Let's just talk about it for a few minutes.
I would say if you desire it at a subtle level, where you're not craving it, but it's enough of a desire that you're willing to work for it in a reasonable manner, and take the long view and say, I would like this to happen eventually. I would like to eventually get to the point of being able to understand this better, which leads me to come back to our next session. But it doesn't mean it's going to drive me crazy between now and then. So that's desire in a healthy way, without craving it and saying, oh my God, I can't go to work because I have to read these 10 books so I can get on the path. So there seems to be some sort of a subtle degree of desire that's reasonable and healthy, but yet not a desire that is craving that is unhealthy. And I don't know how to express it otherwise.
I read somebody said, one of these very smart people, smarter than me, that were reading about how you have to have desire to become a Buddha. And so it's not that you can't just have desire, it's about the harmful desire. Something like that.
So what would harmful desire versus unharmful be? That's a question. I'm just asking as a question, what would it be? What would that mean?
Seems like you'd have to have some sort of desire to have a motivation to motivation to be more compassionate, the motivation to help others.
Yeah, so again, so then how do we distinguish what's a good desire from a bad desire? Or a healthy desire from an unhealthy, or a helpful from an
motivation.
unhelpful?
Intensity.
Attachment.
If it produces you bad karma or whatever, if it's negative desire that creates you to, causes you to do negative things that'll cause you bad causes for you.
Kind of like with suffering, if it's something that's gonna, if you continue it, if it's gonna lead to a bad ending, that's not good desire. But if it's a desire that the continued desire is gonna lead to a good outcome, then that would be a good desire, where you can desire the end of your own suffering, the end of suffering of all sentient beings, and you desire it at a level that leads you to continue to work towards that in a reasonable, rational way, that would be a good desire. If it's a desire that leads you to do irrational things that are harmful to you and harmful to others, then that would be a bad desire.
But I think, from a Buddhist perspective, like a good desire, as you already said, is like desiring, the alleviation of the suffering of others, or desiring others to be happy. But that requires you to be more aware of all the suffering. The alternative, the way most people usually are, is to try to, screen out the suffering of others, because that doesn't lead to happiness, being aware of the suffering of others. But that's like a good desire, to desire happiness of others.
But being aware of the unhappiness and the suffering of others could lead you to work towards their not suffering. Could say, okay, I'll give up my ice cream and put $10 towards the United Way instead. And maybe that's going to help somebody in some little way and make it a little bit better because I was aware of that suffering. So I guess it's a balance. It's a continuing balance. And the more factors you add in, the harder it is to balance it. It's not a balanced scale with 2 platforms anymore. There's 47 platforms and you're trying to balance them all at one time. It's kind of weird and it seems difficult, but it sounds like it's worthwhile.
I've been taught that it's just, these aren't like my own ideas, I'm just saying. But from what I've read and been taught, that it's like, that what makes a good or bad desire is whether it has ignorance or doesn't have ignorance attached to it.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. No.
I almost feel like you have to have the desire to make people's lives better, to suffer yourself, to see their suffering, to then realize that that desire is unhealthy. You have to, in a sense, go through the contemplative cycle of your own suffering and desire so that you can come to the conclusion that it was unhealthy for you and that you don't want to desire it any longer, and then come to peace with that. And come to peace with their suffering, that you can't control that there are some suffering you can't do anything about, and you have to come to peace with that too.
It's an interesting discussion. I was interested in getting
What's the answer, Lauren? Come on.
The answer is in you.
Well, again, from a Buddhist philosophical perspective, there are different levels of answer. First of all, right? So there's not. There is a. I want to say that first. Because like I said, I'm talking. I said a few minutes ago that I wanted to talk on a less subtle level today, right? So I'm going to do that. So there are different levels of subtlety, and also actually different philosophical schools in Buddhism answer these questions slightly differently. So I just want to say that as a preface before I say what I'm going to say. Next time we'll give a slightly different perspective on an answer. Does that make sense? But I want to stay with a fairly, experiential, simple level of an answer for now, which is this. I said earlier that motivation determines the nature of a karmic action, right? So positive motivation or negative motivation. So, for example, there's no mystery that, for example, hatred is a negative motivation and it's going to lead to a bad result, and love is a good motivation and it's going to lead to a good result from a Buddhist perspective, right? But now I want to go into this question about desire as the cause of suffering in that way. In Buddhist psychology, right, in the Buddhist psychological teachings, I think a way of defining this kind of desire is this, it's a desire, right, that's, that misconceives the nature of the object that it desires. So there has to be something, there's always a misconception, in the desire, so I want to differentiate two different things. Not all desires misconstrue the nature of the object. So I'm gonna differentiate, I'm gonna call it afflicted desire and unafflicted desire. So an afflicted desire misconstrues the nature, misunderstands the nature of what it's desiring, and then also misunderstands its relationship to that object. So for example, like when I gave the example earlier about wanting ice cream in order to escape from a feeling of discontent. There's a desire there, obviously, right? There's no mystery that there's a desire in that process, right? So in that case, right, again, I'm not getting into the philosophical thing of emptiness, but just starting on a simple level, right? There's this idea that there's an appearance of ice cream as desirable from its own side, actually. Like you see, when the person in that state of mind sees, what's your favorite kind of ice cream? Like coffee ice cream. So let's say it's either like, what's it called? Haagen-Dazs, coffee ice cream, or Ben and Jerry's. What's your favorite brand? Starbucks. Okay, I didn't even know they made ice cream.
Become very hard to find. I don't like it.
But think about it. You have to check it. This is a great example, though. Let's use that. Let's use the example of which it may not even be fine to. That's good. That's a really good one. So, so think about that, right? Like, so you think of, if your favorite kind of ice cream is Starbucks coffee ice cream, right? That when if you see that, especially because it's hard to find, right? So then, if you want some, right? Like, let's say a person were not feeling happy, and then they're in the store, and they think, "Oh, I probably won't find even this because it's really rare." Very precious, like gold. And then you look at up in the refrigerator case and you see like the coffee Starbucks ice cream right there in the front, right? Immediately, what's the experience? I'm not talking philosophically. Experientially, what happens, right? There's this feeling of like, right? Immediately, like there's a feeling like that, right? You might even literally do that. You might knock people over. Like it depends on the context. If that's the last one, and the other person's smaller, then they might get hurt. But I'm joking. But
You've seen me at the
but there's a feeling of like, wow, there it is, right? That's actually the feeling. Wow, there it is. I want that, right? That there's something there that's like really desirable from its own side. And that can grant happiness, right? That can grant happiness. Let's leave it at that. And what Buddhism is asserting is that's already unrealistic, actually, right? You already have an unrealistic view of the object at that point, right? It's the same thing, like the example I gave earlier about the relationship, right? When the person like is first falling in desire with somebody, and I'm not going to use love because it confuses the terms. If somebody's first falling in desire with somebody else, right, and on the day of their first kiss, right, they think, oh, this person is so wonderful, and they're so beautiful, and they're so perfect for me, and I'll be so happy, with them, right? Like, there's a misconstruing of the nature of the object at that time, just like with the coffee ice cream on the shelf, right? There's a mind that's misconstruing them, or misunderstanding who they are and what that object or thing or person is. So if you misunderstand the nature of what you're desiring in that way, you're already in trouble in terms of happiness and suffering, right? Because you're wanting something that you don't understand your relationship to it and how it exists. Does that make sense so far? So and so there's also always in this desire, there's a mind also wishing to possess the other, right? And they're also like, that's problematic, right? It's problematic. Like for example, I'll use the example of somebody when they're falling in desire with somebody, right? So they want to possess that person, right? there's something wrong already, right? They think the person's perfect. It's a misconception, right? They think they'll always be happy if they can have that person. It's a misconception. And they want to possess that person in some way. It's a negative, sort of say it. If you analyze that, there's no way that a person's not going to suffer, right? So this is not mysterious then, right? In other words, you can analyze it and you can look and you say, of course that person's going to suffer in some way. Of course they're going to feel dissatisfaction because they're not, all those things are not correct, actually, right? So any time that a desire has that kind of quality to it, it's always going to lead to suffering, right? So this, you don't have to be a Buddhist philosopher to understand, right? You can actually analyze your own experience. And you can say, yeah, that's true. And now, again, the problem is that nobody, I mean, unless you're studying Buddhist psychology and you're meditating, nobody ever when they see the coffee ice cream there on the shelf says, oh wow, wait a second, I'm being deluded in my relationship to that. Look, I'm projecting an inherent quality of pleasure, whereas some people are allergic and it's not actually pleasurable from its own side. Some people really hate coffee ice cream. Like, it's not actually desirable from its own side. Some people are lactose intolerant and they see that and they would want to puke or something, so there's nothing desirable about it from its own side. It's not really going to grant me any kind of happiness. And so in other words, nobody does that, right? And and after the first kiss, when nobody analyzes and says, well, this is a projection appearing to my mind about that person. That's not really the nature of their existence. They won't leave me any kind of lasting happiness. Of course, I wouldn't want to possess another person in any way. They're their own person with their own autonomy. In other words, people don't analyze in that way. It's an emotional experience that we get caught up in. That underlying that emotional experience are all these misconceptions or misperceptions, both. And so when the desire is that kind of desire, right, that's unrealistic, and where you're thinking you'll get something from the object that you can never get, right? Like you think I'll get happiness, but it's not in the nature of that object and your relationship to that object to actually grant a meaningful happiness or a real happiness. Again, it is in the nature to grant the happiness of change, right? The suffering of change, right? Which is an alleviation of a previous kind of suffering that we label happiness. But again, that's not what you think when, you know what I mean? And that's not your experience. This is the key really here, is you have to analyze it. If you want to use this in a meaningful way, in my opinion, what's useful is to analyze it experientially, right? To say, what's my experience like when I see that ice cream there, right? And then, what's the nature of the actual relationship? And you have to, and I want to say something else too, right? If you do that once, how useful is that the next time you're in the store? Not much, right? Like, if you did that one time, and then you go back to the store, your appearance and your experience are going to be the same as they always were. But what would it take to the point where your experience was different? In other words, where you actually felt a sense of less of that kind of desire? It would take a lot of time, wouldn't it? Like to change your relationship to chocolate, to a coffee, ice cream, and other people. That would take a long time and a lot of contemplation. But it's possible, right? In other words, it's possible to change the nature of that. But I want to differentiate something from that, right? Like, because if I'm looking at the coffee ice cream and I think that will grant me happiness, right? And that's happy from its own side. It's inherently happy object. It would grant anybody happiness. Anybody would love coffee ice cream, especially the Starbucks brand. And if I have it, I'll be happy, right? If that's the feeling that's there, then that's deluded, right? There's a delusion or an afflicted state of mind that's deluded, right? I want to differentiate that from something else. Like, I'm just going to give an extreme other example, right? If you're, if you were, I'll give you, if you're driving somewhere and you see somebody who got lost and it's like a desert, right? And you have water, and you see that they're parched, right? And they say they're parched. And you think, wow, if I give them some of my water, they'll be less thirsty. Like, that will help them. Right? Is there anything, first of all, is there anything inaccurate in that perception? Or is that a realistic perception? That if I give that thirsty person, they look thirsty, they look parched, they said they're thirsty, I have water, and if I give them water, they'll be less thirsty. Again, I'm giving you very simple examples because it's easier to analyze, right? That's a valid perception. Right?
But they'll get thirsty again.
Yeah, it's not going to But if you thought I'm going to solve all their problems by giving them water, that'd be a delusion, right? But if you thought, well, right now they may die without water. If I give them water, they'll probably survive. I can give them a ride, and then they can, whatever, go on with their life. And I don't know what'll happen after that. You're not overstepping what you can directly reason, right? And you're not thinking, yeah, it would be a total delusion if you thought, I'm going to save them. Like if you thought, I'm going to save them forever and I'm going to make them happy forever by giving this water, that would be deluded, right? But if you thought, you know, they're thirsty, I can give them water right now, give them a ride, and their temporary condition of thirst and danger will be alleviated. That would be an accurate perception. There's nothing exaggerated there, right? And so then if you said, I desire to give them water, right? Like if you were with somebody, let's say you're with your friend, and you say, wow, I really want to give them water, you know, so that's a desire, right? And then you do it. So I want to differentiate, just let's look at those two examples, right? Both of those are actions, so they're karma, right? And so this is actually what Buddhism's getting at in a way. When I said earlier, like, depends on the motivation for the karma, right? In the motivation of the example with the water, right? There's nothing, first of all, there's nothing distorted there, right? There's nothing unrealistic. There's no unrealistic expectation there. And secondly, there's also not an agitated state, right? Like in other words, you're actually, if the person really felt that way, if I imagine myself being that person, right? Then I would feel so happy, like, oh, I'm so glad I can give this person water. And there's a sense of like happiness at being able to do something useful for somebody, right? If you're an ordinary person, that's how you would feel in that way, right? So the mind is not agitated as you do it either, right? Like your mind feels, oh, good, I get to help somebody, and this is easy to help. It's no big hardship, right? It's just water. So I want to point out, like, there are two qualities there. One is it's realistic, right? And the other is it's not agitated. It's not like, there's not an agitated quality to that state of mind experientially. Does that make sense? The other one, again, it's the opposite in those two ways. There are unrealistic things when you see the what's it called? Starbucks coffee ice cream, right? There are these unrealistic views. And then also, if you analyze it honestly and look at your own experience, right? If everybody has to do it for themselves, right? I would see there's some kind of agitation, right? Like, I want that, I have to get it. There's some kind of feeling like that, right? And so those are experiential ways to differentiate, again, on a pretty simple level here, healthy from unhealthy, or, you know, a useful desire or healthy desire from an unhealthy state, from an afflicted desire, right? Do people have questions about that? Or is it pretty straightforward?
What was the technical term for the other kind of desire, it's not afflicted desire?
Yeah, non-afflicted desire, I guess. Yeah. That's okay. There's not really a technical term. But, and I want to say something else though too about this though, because this gets at the point you made. Like that desire, like the desire with the example of water, right? One is not yet fixed. The underlying ignorance about it, the one I said earlier, ignorance grasping an inherent existence. That's still there. There's that's not in that example, right? One is not yet contemplating emptiness while giving the person the water. I'm not talking about something that deep here, right? I'm just talking about ordinary level, right? On an ordinary level, that's a positive karmic action because your motivation, well, your motivation's positive. You don't have an agitated state of mind, and you're seeing things realistically. Does that make sense? So we're not getting philosophical there. We're just saying, on an ordinary level, that will be a positive action because it's an action done with a realistic, conventional understanding of what's going on, and also an unagitated mind. The other one, right? I'm not even talking about that one is conceiving the coffee ice cream as having an inherently existent, independent nature of existence. That's not what we're getting at. We're not getting anything that philosophical. We're talking about like really gross level of distortions, actually, right? Like, that it can grant permanent happiness, that it's desirable from its own side, that all those things. Those are not subtle. Those are like gross levels of distortion. And I'll say also, I was quoting Nagarjuna earlier, and Nagarjuna sometimes points out, if you haven't worked through those levels of distortion, you're not going to be able to understand the lack of intrinsic, the most subtle level of philosophical.
I have a question. So you say like, if you say that you tell your friend that I'm gonna give the water, but it's so generosity though. How is it agitated state of mind?
So it's not agitated, right?
That's okay.
Yeah, so it's not agitated,
Okay.
right? Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because
that's
can be
real
like neutral,
generosity.
can be like, because you're telling a friend, like out of ego, I'm gonna give water, I mean, still, it's not agitated, right?
Oh, yeah, no, I meant like more like, let's say you're in the car and you say like, oh, it's both of our water. Like, so you're saying, oh, I'm gonna give some of my water to
Yeah,
that
you
person.
tell your friend, yeah.
Yeah, not to show off, I didn't mean it like that. I meant like to tell the friend.
But even
Like,
if
I'm
you're
gonna
to
do-
show off, but you're still giving generosity.
Yeah, it depends on the motivation then, like, for example, like, well, you're getting into a subtler point, but let's say this, like, let's say, I was assuming you were saying it like, so the friend wouldn't be upset that I was giving
Yeah.
away some of
Yeah,
our
yeah.
water, you know, so you don't want to upset them. I was assuming it that way. But let's say you were doing it to show off, right? Like, then it would be interesting, right? Because in the moment of saying, I'm gonna give the water away, where there's a feeling like this, right? That would actually be negative karma, right? Because you think, like, because again, there's a distortion, right? The distortion there is, I think this person's view of me is gonna make me happy. That's not true. Right? Also, there's a distortion there, thinking if people think well of me and praise me, then I'll somehow have some kind of happiness in my life. That's not true. It doesn't lead to any real happiness. So there, and then you're doing an action to try to manipulate somebody else's view, right? That's not, so that would be a negative karma. Actually, that moment, right, would be a negative karmic action. But then let's say you take the water, and then when you actually go to the person, you feel some empathy. Like you actually see them as a real person, and then you feel happy to give it to them. Then that moment could be positive karma, right? So
Yeah.
like, then it would end up being mixed, where
Yeah.
in one moment you made a bad karma
Yeah.
by, again, not bad karma because you're immoral, but a bad karma because you weren't seeing it realistically, right? We all do that at times, right? Like, where we suddenly are wanting to show off to somebody, right? But that one, there's a distortion there, right? And there's an agitation. Like, there's a feeling like, I need them to think well of me, and if they don't think well of me, then I'm not gonna be happy, which is all silly, actually, it's not true. Yeah, so then it'll be a mixed, right? The first part would be a negative karma, and the second part could be positive. Now, if when the person was giving the water, they were only looking like, are they seeing me, or are they seeing me? Yeah, then the whole thing would actually be
Yeah,
negative,
okay.
right? So it depends on the motivation at each moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But so do you get the feeling there of the different, I mean, again, we're staying on a experiential, simple, like a level that I think any of us can analyze in our own experience, right? But do you feel the difference there? Like, in other words, could you actually feel how we do both of those, right? Like, in other words, sometimes, and your example is great about people, right? I mean, how often do we do that, right? Where, like, let's say that too, like, right, like where you can analyze this, like Lama Yeshe talks about this in his writings a lot, right? But I want to make a comment about that too, right? Because we say, like sometimes in the, like, well actually, like, so Buddhism would say love is a cause of happiness, because love is a positive state of mind, right? But then, like, sometimes people would say, well, that may not be true. That was why I said earlier, when when a person is falling in desire, right, not falling in love, I said. Because from a Buddhist point of view, those are two different things, right? And this gets at this subtle distinction you were making, right? Because, like, if a person is in a state of mind, I just want to differentiate about love for a moment here, because I think it's a good one to differentiate. Like, if a person is feeling empathy for another person, right? Like, let's say a person is with somebody who they feel a sense of warmth and affection towards, right? And then they think, and then they realistically see, well, this person isn't totally happy. I want them to be more happy, and I want to do something for them that I know them well, and I think it'll make them happy in this moment. If I say something nice, or if I, do some kind gesture to them, right? And if the person doesn't think, therefore they're going to be happy permanently, it's not that kind of distortion, right? And it's out of a sense of warmth, and the person's motivation is, I want them to be happy in this moment, I'm going to try to do this, because in the past I've noticed they like this. That is not distorted, right? And that is not agitated. Right? But I want to differentiate that from when a person is feeling, this other person has to think well of me, or I'm not going to be okay. Right? That's often what's happening. When we say love, a lot of the time, actually our state of mind might be something like that, right? Like, I need this person to think well of me, and if they don't, then I'm going to feel upset. If they do, then I'm going to be happy. The cause of my happiness is them thinking well of me. And so I'm going to, so for Valentine's Day, I'm going to buy them a big something, so that they'll think well of me, so that then I can be happy, and that's the cause of happiness, right? And if that's your motivation, I'm just giving an example because it's Valentine's Day in a few days, right? So if a person buys somebody else a gift for Valentine's Day with the thought, I don't want them to think ill of me because then I won't be happy, right? Is that a cause of happiness? From a Buddhist perspective, no. Actually, from any perspective, no. Right? In other words, like, because actually, you know, you get why. I mean, we just went through that, right? And I'm just differentiating that it's hard sometimes. I guess my point there is this though, is experientially, it's not, if we don't practice introspection, it's sometimes hard to differentiate, right? We confuse, like, positive and negative states of mind, and our language makes that harder. If we call all those things love, you know, then it's a little bit hard. Like we say, well, for example, if when we're angry at somebody and yelling at them, we say we love them, right? Like, I love you and you're an idiot or something. Like, you know, you may love them in some theoretical way, but in that moment, you're not feeling a sense. Because in Buddhism, the definition of love is a feeling, feeling affection towards somebody and wishing them happiness. Right? That's the Buddhist definition of. That's a way of Buddhism of defining love. You feel affection, you feel a warmth and affection for them, and you want them to be happy. So in the moment when you're yelling at them, and you're not feeling that way, right? So actually, from a Buddhist perspective, if you do introspection, that's not love, that's anger, right? So we have to differentiate those states of mind. And again, because in Buddhism, anger is an agitated state of mind, right? So there's no way that leads to happiness. Does that make sense, the difference?
Yeah, but that depends on that would depend on your motivation to be yelling at the person.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right?
Can you give an example? You're talking about like if a parent is yelling at
Right.
a child to help them. Yeah, that's a different thing. Yeah, right.
Because I can't say that I don't love my kid at the time
Yeah, that would be a
the
different.
motivation is, the protective.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, then that's different. Yeah, if you're dealing in anger, if you're angry at somebody, you can't be loving them at the same time. But if you're doing a behavior of shouting, it can be loving.
It
If you're
seems
doing
like
it
it
to
always
help them.
comes back to the motivation. Like, what is really the motivation for you?
Yeah, and that's what we have to. So that's what this teaching is saying, actually, right? If you look at this level of presenting the Four Noble Truths, right? Isn't that what it's saying, actually, right? And I'll say one more. Yeah, we just have a couple more minutes. I want to say one more thing, just to contemplate this, right? In terms of, I want to say a couple. Yeah, so I'll say two more things. So next time we're going to get into a subtler definition, but for now I just want to say this. So this process we're describing, right, of wanting something, of having desire for something, thinking it'll grant me happiness, trying to get it, and then having the suffering of change happen. This is not the most subtle philosophical answer again, but that's samsara. Right? Whereas when Buddhism says samsara, I just want to say samsara is not a place, right? You can't say like samsara is the mall, right, or samsara is my house, or like ultimately samsara is my own body and mind. Ultimately, I mean, it's I'm not in samsara, I am samsara. It's actually more philosophically correct to say it's not more philosophically. You could say I am samsara. Whereas my life and my way of living is samsara, in that sense. So in Buddhism, samsara is not a place that you can get out of. Right? Samsara is a way of. Samsara is ultimately it's your own body and mind, actually, but it's also a way of relating to things. And then I want to say the last point for today, which is this: so the idea with all of this, right? I just want to ask to think, just to contemplate for a moment for yourself, right? On average in your life, and again, I want to be really clear. This is not about blame, right? This is not about blaming ourselves. It's just about analyzing honestly, for each, so if we introspect, there's introspection, right? How much of the time are we in a state where we're being unrealistic, right? And following a desire, hoping for happiness, following a desire for something, thinking that will get me happiness? And you have to answer that for yourself. I don't have an answer for you, right? But you have to, if you analyze that carefully, right? And it doesn't have to be an object. It can also be a process, right? So sometimes it can be an object like the coffee, Starbucks, ice cream. And sometimes it can be, somebody else thinking well of me. And sometimes it can be, somebody thinking I'm right, and not thinking I'm wrong. And sometimes, so there are a lot of things we can desire thinking that will give me happiness, right? If they think I'm right, then I'll be happy. And until I can convince them, that would be another example of it. of an unrealistic desire. You know, or, you know, and in Buddhism there's this teaching on the 8 worldly concerns. So those are like wanting praise and not wanting blame, wanting pleasure and not wanting displeasure, wanting, you know, there's a let's see, pleasure, pain, loss, wanting to gain things, not wanting to lose things, wanting a good reputation, not wanting a bad reputation, right? Like, what Buddhism's asserting is that, and those are things that don't bring lasting happiness. Those are a list of 8 things that don't, that if you are desiring those, they never lead you where you want to go. And one thing in Buddhist psychology that they assert is if ordinary people, actually, so you may not be ordinary, but if ordinary people analyze their own experience, that most of their time is spent on those things. Like and that's just, again, it's not like, what's the right way to say this? It's not like blaming anybody or saying you're wrong. It's not moralistic. It's just saying we have to analyze our own experience because that doesn't lead to happiness. Right? And if you spend your time wanting those things, you end up, it's like, Lama Zopa sometimes says, it's like drinking ocean water to try to quench your thirst, is the problem. And Shantideva, in this quote, you know, there's a quote in some of the readings, where he says, it's kind of like that, my point earlier about Lama Zopa, about the yogis in the mountain. There's a quote from Shantideva where he said, you get the sense of like unbearable sadness from Shantideva. And he says, people desperately want happiness, and they run straight into suffering. You know, and you get the sense of him looking at people and just feel like you get the sense of, you know, you can imagine him like Shantideva if he were at the mall or at the grocery store, like he would just watch people and like be crying or something or laughing, I'm not sure which, and just thinking like, wow, look, everybody's doing that, you know, like if you had gone, I don't know, imagine Shantideva looking on Match.com or something. Everybody's doing that. They're wanting happiness from right towards something. And again, I'm not against relationship. I'm just saying the way people relate to it. You know, it's not about grocery stores are wrong or malls are wrong or Match.com. I'm not saying any of those are wrong. I'm saying so it's not the object that's wrong. It's the process that we engage in that Shantideva is looking at and saying, that's so sad, right? Like that people want happiness but go towards suffering. And what he was getting at was this. It was this process of how we generate unrealistic desires and follow them. So does that make sense there? I just want to be really clear. So that's one, you know, we've covered now one way of looking at the first 2 noble truths, right? So next time, I'll get to the third kind of suffering, and we'll get just a little more philosophical about that, but then we'll get into what are the last 2 noble truths. So we really cover this whole topic of the middle scope, because the middle scope, and just the last thing I'll say, so the middle scope, just to finalize this, is actually is not just an aspiration for some good future life or something, right? The middle scope means that a middle scope practitioner understands the nature of suffering, understands what causes suffering, understands that it's possible to actually end suffering, that's possible, right? Which is the third noble truth. So these are all hard things to understand, actually, right? But once the person understands all that, they become a middle scope practitioner when they actually develop that their main wish in their life is to be liberated, to achieve moksha, or liberation, or freedom from suffering, a permanent cessation of suffering. That's when a person is a middle scope Buddhist practitioner. So you know, we're not yet even, you know, we're not yet at that point of understanding all of that, but we've begun. So does that make sense? Okay. And let's just end, you know, we always end like this. So with karma, since we started to talk about karma, the beginning point is to generate a good motivation, which we did today, right? And then the last point, just to make karma complete, actually. And we'll have a whole module on karma, we'll get into this, but I just want to say, so for today we always do this. This the last step to make a karma complete is we dedicate it. So we actually feel happy. First of all, we should feel good that, you know, even that we did our best together to have some understanding of some, you know, some insight or some understanding of our own experience. Actually, you know, in one way you could say of something about our experience, of something true. We tried to understand also the teachings a little bit of the Buddha and the Four Noble Truths. So now we dedicate that. Right? So you can dedicate your own way. But I'll just say something like, you know, so through this karma, through this merit, through this virtue, you know, first of all, may each of us actually be able to understand deeply, right, our own experience. May we be able to understand the Four Noble Truths as they relate to our experience. You know, and may we be able then to abandon anything that causes suffering, and to take up anything that leads to genuine, lasting cessation of suffering, and that leads to peace and happiness. And then, may each of us be able to achieve, through that kind of insight, enlightenment, and then be able to help others, help countless others who are also suffering in all these ways. May we be able to help them, help countless others, to understand their own experience, and to achieve liberation from suffering, and to achieve enlightenment. So then, we dedicate any energy from this to be of benefit to countless others, to ourselves and also countless others. So that we can become enlightened, just like the Buddha did, teach just like the Buddha did. In order to be useful to whoever's around us. In this life also, in all times, always to be useful to revealing some things that are true and overcoming illusions and false misunderstandings.